what a pleasure and privilege to be part of these intense weeks of discussion and reflections on a subject that is very dear to my heart. I've been studying translation for many years, been puzzled by many aspects of it since it's everywhere. Thank you, James and Edwin, for inviting me to this beautiful place, and also for involving me in some of the previous discussions. And I appreciate this opportunity to share some of my current thinking on translation. Now, so today I call it lecture 1. I was asked to do 3, so I prepared 3. The first one is called the question of difference in translation. This should sort of complement Sherry's earlier discussion of territorialization and the question of space in relation to language, or politics of space and language. And in my lecture, I'm going to focus on universalism and the place of number in translation. On Wednesday, I'm going to shift the focus slightly to a related issue called when translation puts X in motion. So essentially, this is to rethink the materiality and the medium of translation. It's still related to what I'm going to present today, but it's going to take the discussion in a slightly different direction. And on Friday, I'm going to focus directly on the politics of translation. So how we think about the political in relation to translation. And this is related to a recent article that I submitted to Translations, Transdisciplinary Journal, with which many of you are familiar. Okay, so here's how I organized my lectures. Unfortunately, I arrived late yesterday, only last night, and have missed Naomi Seidman's lectures, and I heard that you had interesting discussions about conversion. In this session, I wanted to revisit the ground of our common assumptions about linguistic and cultural differences that underlie all discussions of conversion. I think a conception of conversion. What do we mean by crossing over, right? Differences. Where is that line? Some conceptual work needs to be done, I thought. And I wanted to raise some questions about this. And so, first, a few remarks about the assigned readings. And I assigned 2 texts. One is Jacques Derrida's Form and Meaning from Margins of Philosophy, and the other is from an article from my old edited volume, Tokens of Exchange, that James just mentioned. It was published like 1999, so almost 20 years, getting to 20 years. So these are the 2 pieces. They're very different pieces. I don't know if people had a chance to read them. Yeah? Okay, great. So we're on the same page. It's very important. So Derrida's piece is your typical example of deconstruction. And I think that term is kicked around a lot. I'm not saying here, but elsewhere. And so, but then to get a precise meaning of what exactly he's doing, a deconstruction, what does it mean to do deconstruction? And this is a very good example. And it's related to our thinking about language. And deconstruction practices slow reading, in a Nietzschean sense, slow reading. Here in this essay, Derrida is trying to poke holes in the foundations of European metaphysics, going back to the fundamentals via his reading of Husserl's phenomenology. And he basically raises questions about the assumption about language as expression in Husserl's idea of rethinking of metaphysics, such as the proposed distinction between the form of meaning and the form of sense. We don't have to go into that discussion because it's Derrida's quarrels with Husserl. Okay, it's not our quarrel with Derrida. Okay, but then still we need to be very clear as to what he's doing and how he sees the duality of the strata operates as part of a circular reasoning in Husserl's phenomenology. So, deconstructive reading presents a powerful linguistic challenge to logical reasoning and the philosophical traditions of the West. One problem with this essay, of course, is that the implicit claims of universalism are not brought to light or critiqued on the ground of language. So I'm not saying that Derrida hasn't done that elsewhere, but here, that's not the focus. Okay, so, but he gives us a very good, nice moment of slow reading that takes us to the problem of interpretation, how to understand some of the fundamental problems in our discussion of language. And by extension, I'm going to say translation. Now, my essay, the question of meaning value in the political economy of the sign, it presents a very different method. Okay, it's not deconstruction. It's historicizing. Not only that, it's a critical, what I would call critical translation theory, which proposes a method to analyze the rise of meaning out of somewhere or nowhere in discussion, in dialogue with theorists like Baudrillard, whom one could call a critical semiotician. Through the example of George Samnas's extraordinary career, this this imposter, a wonderful imposter who claimed that he was kidnapped by some Jesuit missionaries from Formosa, or Taiwan, known as Taiwan, to Europe, okay, to be converted. So that's the connection there. Through this example, I try to show that the articulation of difference as value within a structure of unequal exchange simultaneously victimizes that difference by translating it as a lesser value or non-universal value. Unlike philosophers, anthropologists in the West used to love cultural difference, and they authorize that difference as an already translated fact on the world map filled with flora, fauna, and other sorts of curious facts. You know, multiplicity of this and that. In that sense, they speak for that difference in a universalizing idiom. This is the issue that Vance was just raised earlier about what governs. What is the thing that governs language and conversion? What is that? So now I wanted to focus more squarely on this problem, not taking translation as a metaphor. I'm not saying you cannot take translation as a metaphor. You can, of course, even molecular biologists use this metaphor all the time. And so what is they talk about DNA, RNA. RNA is a translator, and so, and from the very beginning, the creation of the discipline of molecular biology, they started using translation as a metaphor. So then we're not getting anywhere. It's an unthought idea of translation. It's a metaphor, productive, totally productive, because it gave rise to a discipline, molecular biology. Okay, so, but it says nothing about translation. It's our job to really look at what we mean by translation. Are we confusing it with language? Okay, the movement of language. Are we confusing it with difference? Are we confusing it with multiplicity? So I wanted to ask some questions about what we're doing when we talk about translation. And in this lecture, as I said, I wanted to really focus on the place of universalism in the articulation of difference, because merely speaking of difference doesn't get us anywhere, because there's always some shadows, governing shadows there. Okay, so I hope that's clear. That's where I'm going. I wrote this book called The Freudian Robot when I was doing research on the emergence of digital media. And then I did some historical research on the problem of universal language. I'm not talking about the earlier 17th century, 18th century search for the universal language. That's a very different. I'm talking about early 20th century reconceptualization. Of course, there are connections, but I'm just focusing on the early 20th century preoccupation with a universal language, which then led to a universal code, which then led to what we all know as machine translation. So I'm really looking at this genealogy. Now, what is universal language? When I put these 5 terms down, you might think, well, you can read horizontally: British, American, scientific, international, and commercial. Right? Okay. So, but then it makes better sense, perhaps, to read vertically. Right? So you all recognize you can read horizontally or vertically. It's not all just, okay. So what is this doing? Because here there's a thing called basic English. Reading it horizontally is English. Reading it vertically is basic. So it's basic English. Basic English consists of 850 words, okay, created by C.D. Ogden in collaboration with its chief disseminator, I.A. Richards. Okay, so we're talking about the interwar years. Let's say global language. This was the term that came out of this article from Time magazine in the 40s, early 40s, called a supranational language for the communication of all men on the face of a rapidly shrinking globe. This was before the digital media. So the promise was in this basic English 850 word vocabulary, which could do anything, whatever you want, but mostly focusing British, American, international, diplomacy, of course, right? Commercial, scientific, commercial. So these are the areas. So we should not be surprised, because these are the domains where global English really dominates. Okay, but then it came up much earlier than our internet. Warren Weaver was the architect of machine translation. He coordinated World War II and post-war scientific work on intelligence and code breaking, and and very powerful gatekeeper to post-war American communication technology. And he says, he was trying to convince people like Warren Weaver, cyberneticians, that it's very tempting to say that a book written in Chinese is simply a book written in English, which was coded into the Chinese code. If we have useful methods for solving almost any cryptographic problem, may it not be that with proper interpretation, we already have useful methods for translation. He was referring to World War II code breaking. Right? Without knowing a language, you could break the code. And there were some successful examples. And World War II communication technology led to post-war acceleration of code work, this code work. And then Warren Weaver tried very hard to jumpstart a program on machine translation. And after decades of efforts, organized efforts, it just this project just failed so many times because this foundation was flawed. It was based on grammatical, syntactical units that they identified that could correspond, okay? So when you say a book written in Chinese is simply a book written in English, you're making really some extraordinary claims about a universal code. And this is what lies behind a lot of claims of machine translation. And this is I.A. Richards, who also used pictorial visual codes. He pioneered in the Disney cartoon series for the dissemination of basic English. So, and he also was someone who used the visual aids in the teaching of English literature at Harvard University. As Helen Wendler recalls, she was in his class. Okay, so as we were talking about like interwar years, post-war years, World War II, right? Okay, back in 1935, I.A. Richards was promoting basic English. He said the only way in which false and misleading approximations to Western units of meaning with Chinese equivalents can be avoided is by giving these meanings through and together with an apparatus for comparing meanings through an explicit analytic language. Oh, okay, so what did he have in mind? Basic English, right? So you need a universal code that can help you avoid false and misleading understandings. So these were universal claims that were made throughout the 20th century, okay, having to do with communication technology, okay? So I thought maybe we should revisit the limits of some key concepts in light of what has happened, okay, in translation theory and practice with which you are familiar. One of them is the communication model of translation, which underlies I.A. Richards, Ogden's, and Warren Weaver's assumptions about translation. That is, language is about translation. And the second is the theological model of translation, of which many of you have already analyzed, some of you. I also wanted to highlight the fallacy of the etymological approach. Sometimes we could start with the term translatio, Latin, which is about the moving of relics from place to place. Okay, it's a very interesting mode of operation for getting at the roots of this term, but it's extremely limited. I tend not to go for etymological approaches because there are so many languages which etymology would authorize your theoretical work, right? That's a problem. Do we go with Latin? What about languages that are not Latin derived, right? So then that's a problem. Should I then still acknowledge the universal status of Latin? No, I don't think so. And there are competing universals there at the level of theoretical discourse. In fact, in English, you also have interpreting, which it also means like you have a multiplicity of terms associated with what we do, right? So we can't go with the etymology of one while ignoring the other. And then I put Fanyi in Chinese, which is a modern Chinese. The second character, the first character means, some of you know Chinese, what does it mean? Turning over, flip over, right? And the second character means interpret, right? But then in classical, for instance, Buddhist translations, right? We're talking about ancient Buddhist scripture translations in China. You didn't have just a translator. They had numerous people tasked with different stages of the work. So they didn't have a singular translation, right? Someone would read out Sanskrit, someone who knew Sanskrit and one of the Chinese languages. By the way, there are hundreds of Chinese languages. Today, still over 100. So essentially, there is no Chinese language. Sorry, there is no Chinese language. There are many languages in that place, and there's lingua franca, Mandarin. That's the language. And writing overrides all the languages. So you don't have to learn foreign language in order to communicate with, for example, the Japanese. You just write. Writing is the universal medium. I'm not going into it. Japanese decided to have their own national language to try to get rid of Chinese characters as much as they can, but not successfully. But in any case, we're really talking about a very complicated sets of activities trying to interpret some document, Sanskrit, and other Buddhist writings. Okay. On Wednesday, I'm going to focus on script and writing, which raise a different set of issues here, because we often talk about language. What are we talking about? Okay. So if we're talking about script, that requires a different set of approaches. We're talking about writing systems, a set of approaches that would be different from script. We're talking about language, that would be still. These are three different dimensions, right? So, in any case, so Buddhist translation, the second character here was indeed used in ancient practices, what today we call translation. It was not exactly what we think. All right, I'm not going to go further into that. Now, the question of difference in language and translation, as I said earlier, this is a very thorny issue, because we really need to, when we say these units are similar and those other units are different, what do we mean? By what standard, a universal standpoint, a vantage point, do we judge the similar and the different? So these are the issues that one has to think about. And then related to that is the ontological multiplicity of languages themselves. How do we determine that, for instance, in Chinese writing is just one language? Multiple languages within one writing, is that possible? And then even a word. How many concepts are there in a single word? Or turn it around. How many words are there in a concept? So I don't think we have thought thoroughly about these issues. So we need some rigor in thinking about how people draw distinctions among these various ontologies. Are they valid or not? Are we confusing things? Now, the place of number is really the place to get into the problem from a pedagogical point of view. Since this is sort of a seminar, I thought maybe we could take this as the point of entry, because usually you don't think of numbers as needing translation. Yeah? But then we'll see that actually it's quite central to our thinking about translation, a number. It's of course related to the last point, multiplicity. All right, these are philosophical issues that they can lead to all sorts of directions, and that's not our task today. Okay, so I'm going to some of the basics in translation. How does a translate establish units of equivalency? That's what we call similarity, or non-equivalency, difference between language A and language B. Of course, that is predicated on a certainty, our certainty about what makes a language A and what makes a language B, right? It's not always self-evident. But then the question of unit of translation is really central. You can talk about translatabilities, untranslatabilities, but then the real issue here is how do you establish your units of equivalency and non-equivalency before you can talk about what's translatable or what is not translatable, all right? So that is the question. So I'm going to raise some questions, and maybe we can discuss it later. Which difference qualifies as difference and why? Assuming from a certain ontological point of view, you know, the universe is full of differences. But then for the purpose of translation, what is difference? Why does that matter? Okay. What role, if any, does the logic of equivalency, I just, you know, for the purpose of, you know, for simplicity, x equals y, all right? So play in the marking of difference, borders, or non-equivalences in general. So it involves some marking, as Sherry's lecture suggested very well. Language territorializes. It marks identities. It marks the friend and enemy, the distinction. It marks this and that, right? So, but then how can you talk about difference outside the logic of equivalency? Right. If we have not acknowledged the existence of x equals y, how do we even recognize that as x does not equal y? All right. So these are the theoretical questions we really need to think about instead of going merely in metaphorical directions. Okay. Why has this logic largely been eluded our critical analysis of translation? Essentially, I'm taking you into numerical direction. That's the place of number. Suppose, usually when we think about actual practice of translation, like a textual translation, we think of one word in one language, another word in another language, right? So unit 1 equals unit 1. Sometimes 2 words in one language equals 1 word. We're playing with numbers without knowing that we're playing with numbers, okay? So how many numbers, you know, how big the number could be on one side or the other side of the equation, right? So these would test a limit about translatability. These are the implicit governing shadows. Can we identify discursive traditions that render certain ideas of translation legible while occluding others? So this is not just a call for to move away from Eurocentric, and a lot of people have critiqued Eurocentrism. That's not my interest. I think there are more important matters to consider than critiquing Eurocentrism. All right. So let's look closely at the logic equivalency in translation. Okay, I'm not, when I speak of logic equivalency, this is something that I identify, and I think you will identify in many instances of translation. Okay, it's not that we should privilege it or should credit for something, and it's something that we really need to take seriously. X in language A equals or not equals Y in language B, so that's easy to understand. In mathematics, you can use these signs: equal sign, less or more sign. These little mathematical signs signal or mark the place where equivalence is brought into being, right? Okay, but in verbal exchange, you don't have these little signs that gives you, okay, here. These little signs that mathematicians love, without which they cannot operate. But in literature and textual work, we leave them out. Sometimes the copula serves that purpose, but that's a different story. Where they exist would be, okay, so these are the signs that really underlie what people claim as translatables and untranslatables. And so when people say, oh, I'm in favor of untranslatables, okay, so let's first look at what gets left behind is you said nothing about translatables. So what do you mean by translatables, right? So that's a problem, you know. Let's have some conceptual rigor, and so this is what the emphasis I'm putting on. The logic of equivalency produces the same and the different in a ceaseless movement of resignification. So I want to emphasize this point. So it's the logic of equivalency that's the governing shadow that creates what we recognize as similar and simultaneously what we recognize as different. Okay, in a ceaseless movement, it doesn't stop. As Vance was suggest, it doesn't stop. It's an ongoing process, conceptual process, resignification, always going on. Okay, that's why it's very difficult to grasp this process. Right? Now, I wanted to propose this. My quarrel with people who love untranslatables is that and also my quarrel with Walter Bayami is that they have left nonsense out of their discussion of sense. And in the Derrida piece chapter I assigned you, he talks about Husserl's distinction between Bedeutung and Sinn. That distinction was made by Husserl. And Derrida deconstructs it and says it's circular reading, all right, reasoning. Okay, but he doesn't go. Derrida's problem with Husserl is that in trying to get at the form of sense, Husserl has to get rid of the form of meaning, which is associated with intentions, but Husserl doesn't really succeed in doing that. And this is what Derrida is showing, right? But then, well, the problem of nonsense as a problem of sense has been bugging for a long time. And of course, this comes from my reading of Freud, psychoanalysis. Freud has a wonderful essay on jokes. What's the title of that essay? Yes, that's the one. Oh, yeah, on jokes, and then he gives us many interesting analysis as to how children have more tolerance for nonsense than adults. We have been educated to exclude nonsense as a source of pleasure, a source of confusion, a source of uncertainties, something really bad, negative. We love sense. We're anxious, paranoid about sense, all in order to exclude. That happens in our translation processes all the time, right? Aside from trying to establish equivalences among units in different languages, we worry about not getting at the meaning of the original a lot. Essentially, we try to expel nonsense from sense. From the point of view of one language, the other language is always potentially full of nonsense. Babbling sounds if you don't know the language well, all right? So I wanted us to think about this. This is also what mathematics is, some mathematics try to exclude nonsense. You need a well-ordered universe. So in other outside mathematics, which relies on these little marks to order our universe, to establish a clear distinction among terms, equal or not equal, greater or lesser. In our common speech, we use metaphors all the time. So what is a metaphor? A metaphor is a compression of the multiplicity like x equals y in a single term. Well, this is my invention. You may disagree. Jacobson would come up with a different definition through his vertical, horizontal play. And then another issue, other than nonsense, multiplicity, in our translation work, theoretical work and practice as well, is the undecidability of the original. This is a classic problem in translation studies. Okay, I'm going to give you an example which shows all of these. This example comes from a 4th century Chinese poet, woman poet, 4th century, who created a work. Now I'm using a term in English because you have to say either a or many, plural or singular. The language really constrains our ability to think about these things, ontologies, outside given numerical order, either one or many, right? In English, in Chinese, I don't have to worry about that. Okay. So let's think about nonsense, multiplicity, and the undecidability of the original. These are all very central issues in translation. I wanted you to consider this work. This work consists of 841 characters. Don't worry if you don't read Chinese. By a woman poet from the 4th century who didn't write it, who wove all of the characters in a silk brocade. And as legend goes, she sent it to her husband. I'm not going to give you the legend because I think it's a made-up legend. This extraordinarily talented woman decided to wove these characters, 841 characters, into this piece of fabric. I'm sure you read Derrida's critique of Husserl's, like interwoven text, right? If he had known Su Hui's poem or poems, he would have done a better job critiquing Husserl. But the problem is, ignorance is such a privilege for European scholars. I won't go into that. So he could afford not to know, right? You ask a Chinese philosopher today, can they afford not to know Husserl or phenomenology or Derrida? Okay, so there you go. So I wish he had known this poem. It would have given him a much more powerful argument against phenomenology and its preoccupation with beautiful form. I'm adding beautiful, but actually form, right? So what is this original? This is untranslatable, not for the reason that Emily Apter would propose. No, it's because of the undecidability of the original. This is depending on which direction you read the characters, horizontally, vertically, diagonally, you know, circles, left to right, up and down, you get, according to some scholars who studied, nearly 3,000 poems out of this one woven fabric of poems. So it is one, but it's many. Ontological multiplicity, we're not dealing with one poem. Okay, so, and it's also color-coded. When I asked you to identify basic English, I sort of replicated this. 5 color, the color also suggests a mode of reading. All right, so that's another semiotic order that we often overlook. But I'm not going to go to the color code. I'm going to focus on numbers. So 841 characters give rise to nearly more than 2,000 poems, depending on which direction you're reading. So it's the number that makes it untranslatable. You don't know which one you're translating. Okay, here. All right. Wait a minute. Okay. Nonsense as a problem of sense, multiplicity in a single shape, right? Undecidability of the original. How many poems are there in Su Hui's work? And this is a very famous work called The Table of the Turning Sphere from the 4th century. Okay. It's a woman's work, sort of in the domain of women's textile, weaving, work on the loom. There are some modern scholars who try to replicate her weaving technique. And then and they have identified what do you call woof and warp. Okay, so that's how you, it's a magnificent mathematical work of poetry from the 4th century. Don't you think Derrida could have used it as a much more powerful intellectual tool to critique phenomenology? Unfortunately. All right, so here's the summary. Is this unique to the combinatorial probabilities of Chinese characters? Okay, we're really talking about probability of which character can be combined with which character to generate rhythm, rhyme, and also image that would be coherent. How many origins are there in this 29 by 29 matrix? We're talking about very small piece. By the way, Claude Shannon, the only way we could explain this is through Claude Shannon's racial entropy and redundancy. Claude Shannon, as some of you might know, was the founder of information theory. Okay. I did a lot of work on. He actually was the one who identified who turned English alphabet into a different code. I'm going to go into that. So it's the number problem here that is associated with meaning, the production of meaning. All right, and then Claude Shannon was very close to explaining Su Hui's work because cyberneticians and information theorists were also very much aware of the 16 by 16 matrix writing machine in Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I had a discussion on this in the Freudian Robot. This is the imagined writing machine in Jonathan Swift. This is when Gulliver visited the Legato Academy, where a professor invented a writing machine, and he had students turning these levers to produce randomly sentences, sense or nonsense. All right. So again, the production, this was really a pre-digital age, sort of. We're talking about 18th century, imagining of a writing machine before the invention of the typewriter and all of that. And it's fascinating, of course, in Swift's depiction of it, this is condemned as speculative science, right? Look at what these people are doing. They're ridiculed. This professor who leads a team of students turning levers and then so delighted by a probable sentence that would make sense in English. Although if you look at this illustration, these symbols resemble less English than George Samnasa's fictional alphabet from Formosa. And in fact, Jonathan Swift knew Formosa and modeled his modest proposal. You must have read this in high school, on George Samnasa's fantastic narrative account of his experience as a native in Formosa. All right, so these are related. Okay, so supposedly if this machine had been built, it would produce English sentences or nonsense, probabilistically. Okay, so that was the idea. You see, literature and digital work are very closely related. Okay, we go from 850 word basic English, Ogden's and Richard's English, to Su Hui's 841 character poems, to this. Okay, see, this is the numerical order we're talking about. That order is governed by the relationship between nonsense and sense. A French mathematician who influenced Jacques Lacan's work very much said, under the protective banner of present-day cybernetics, it would seem that Swift's dream has now become a reality. It is not, of course, hand-operated, but electronic, and produces even what some people venture to call poems. This, of course, anticipates a lot of the poetry machines that proliferate on the internet. So they know something about numbers, that can produce poems, all right? For example, in my own research, I've looked at the kind of machine-produced poems, automatic writing at Bell Labs, which came out of this John Pierce's work. It happened one frosty look of trees waving gracefully against the wall. Is this English? It's English, but it's a verse. It is verse, sort of borderline. Very interesting. So when I was at graduate school, I started reading structuralism. I was introduced to structuralism and post-structuralism. And you all recall there was this Hollenbach's essay, The Death of the Author. And it really, for many years, I wanted to find out who killed the author. Finally, through my research on the Freudian robot, I found out it was a Bell Labs scientist. But I'm joking. They decided that mathematically speaking, you don't have to produce a verse through consciousness, someone's authorial consciousness. You simply play the number game invented by Claude Shannon. I don't have the time to go into that game. It's in my that book. But this is what they produced. It's not by someone's consciousness. It was by numbers. That is, frequencies that govern the combinatorial probability of letters. And that's how you produce it, okay? It's somewhat like Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky. You know this poem, right? Okay, so you have this poem in English, a number of words, are nonsense words. Freud would have said, children love it, but what would adults make of it? And there are adults who really try to make sense of it. It's very interesting. And then, or at one end, the other end, James Joyce, Finnegan's Wake, with the very first line, of this book is this. Unreadable. And of course, there are a few preceding this. This is a 100-letter sequence. You can't call it word, it's a noun word. 100-letter noun word. It's preceded by legible words, the fall. And then it goes like this. Okay, so what is he doing? He was collaborating with C.D. Ogden, the person, the Cambridge guy who invented basic English. They were in touch. In fact, he was invited, Joyce was invited to translate some of his works into basic English. By the way, I think Voice of America during the Cold War used basic English too. Very popular. This is Shannon, the inventor of information theory, who came up with some remarkable mathematical formula which led to the revolutionizing of information technology. This is the classic information theory, okay, receiver. But what I'm getting at is not this one. This is the engineer's idea of information. I don't think it's useful for us to think about translation. Like you feed you feed information at this end, information source and transmit, and then destination. But don't forget there's also noise source. The aim of the information engineer is to reduce this noise, but it was entirely an engineering technological problem here. But there are philosophical implications. So what I'm getting at is Shannon's other insight. That is, he came up with an idea called printed English. Printed, that is discrete English, based on his work on Markov, Russian mathematician Andrei Markov's work. What did Markov do? He counted the number of vowels and consonants in Eugene Onegin. And so it was the first mathematical analysis of a poem, elaborate analysis, which led to a mathematical invention called the Markov chains, which underlies all of Shannon's work. Okay, so again, poetry and mathematics are together, so we can't separate them. All right, and so Markov chains looks like this. And if you look at Shannon's groundbreaking essay, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, published in 1948, you'll find this analysis. Okay, so what does he do? He counts letters. Sounds so banal. This is not how we read a text. You count letters. Like a machine can count letters without knowing the meaning. It's entirely possible. I don't know if some translators do the same thing. Here, for him, printed English has an additional letter 27, which is space. It's not the space that Sherry was talking about. It is a mathematical space. That is, in Shannon's study of Markov chains and also telegraph code, we often, he noticed something that other people didn't. If you're familiar with the Morse code, you have a short and long, da, da, right? So you have minimal symbols that would generate combinations that can transmit information. You don't need more because it's just too complicated, right? You could go with optical means and sound, a radio, whatever. As long as you just one short, one long. But he noticed something else. He says, what is more important is the pause, is the space in between. If you didn't have space, there's no meaning. Recall the first sentence from Finnegan's Wake. It's a long 100-letter sequence. There's no spacing. So something that we sort of know unconsciously, but not articulated mathematically, and he did. So this is a discrete symbol. What is a discrete symbol for the engineers? That is a symbol that can be recognized and processed by a machine. Okay, so like a computer. The computer doesn't read words, the computer reads letters, and letters are discrete. All right, what is so interesting, according to the discoverer Shannon and other information theorists, that the letter space is more frequent than the letter E in English, and in almost all alphabetical languages. Okay, and as some of you are familiar, you must be aware of a lot of experimental writing, automatic writing in French and also in English, where a writer would leave out letter E and see what happens, right? Or leave out letter O and see what happens. So there were lots of experiments with this implicit grasp of this frequency of letters in the determination of meaning, right? And so if you leave out this frequency, then you can't even start to talk about meaning and non-meaning, right? So we learned something from information theory, that is, letter space is more frequent than letter E or any other English letters. 17% in English, French, and Spanish, 16% in Italian, where in Italy, I don't know if you can verify this, and 14% in German, which sort of conforms to our intuition here. And then letter E, see, compare, 16% in English, 10 in French, 11 Spanish, 10 Italian, 14. So they actually counted the frequencies in letter formations, combinations through many samples. Okay, and then they came up with this. And this lies behind all of the coding in our computers, the computer we use. Okay, not word processing. We're talking about the basic coding here, right? So, so his experimental work on the stochastic mentions of printed English. Bear with me. I'm going more into this because I think this helps us understand the problem of number in the making of sense or nonsense. Okay, so here Shannon experimented with spacing. When you have spacing or a certain frequency of combination, this is what happened. So the first sample, nonsense characters, no sense, because the combination, a letter like Q and P don't appear together that often in English. So it makes no sense, all right? So, but then they sort of build the frequency like T and H appear together, more frequently. So they build the frequency for each possible combinations through mathematical means. And then you have something which is kind of bizarre, the head and in frontal attack. It's just not grammatical, but it's still English, right? And then they move forward. This is how they designed our computer, our digital world. Quite remarkable. I'm going to conclude. Do I have a few more minutes? I can't resist this. Since I already introduced Su Hui's 4th century poem, which is a very interesting way of thinking about meaning and number, I'm going to conclude with Yuan Renzhao, of whom many of you don't know. By the way, in the humanities, the community of scholars seems more scattered than the scientific community. For instance, Yuan Renzhao was a friend of Norbert Wiener's. He invited I.A. Richards to teach at Tsinghua University in China a number of times because Richards wanted to promote his basic English in China. And then he also was involved in many other activities involving the circles that would later be known as the cybernetics group, including von Neumann, all the leading minds that created the digital world we know today. Okay, So he was invited to participate in the 10th Conference on Cybernetics, which is known as the Mason, let's see. And he was there were 10 conferences organized by this key group of scientists in America, and they invited people from all over the world. Zhao was teaching at Berkeley, was a Harvard-trained linguist, musicologist, and was teaching at UC Berkeley. And he was invited to give a paper to this group where Shannon was also in the audience, okay? The same intellectual scientific elite, international elite, who communicated with each other, who were friends with one another, who taught each other, okay? So Yuan Zhao was asked to participate. He gave a paper called Meaning in Language and How It Is Acquired. Gave an example to experiment with the threshold of sense and nonsense. He didn't use Shannon's language. Although Shannon was sitting in the audience, I doubt that he really digested, but he had very good intuition. That is entropy and redundancy as a measure of information. The more entropy you have, according to Shannon, the more information you get, right? Redundancy reduces information. It's a ratio. It's in this book, if you're interested in reading his contribution, Cybernetics Group, all right? So I'm giving you this sort of a big picture. Basic English information theory of cybernetics, the same intellectual elite who did the same work together. Norbert Wiener, Shannon, C.K. Ogden, Richards, Yan Zhao, there were others. Zhao then, in his talk, created a fable of sense and nonsense in Chinese characters. Don't worry if you don't read Chinese, as a number of you can read. I would invite one of you to read it out loud. This is a fable that Zhao created to illustrate the threshold of sense and nonsense. Could someone read it out loud? The first 2 lines. Yes, please. Yeah. Okay. No sense, nonsense in language, but sense in writing. All right, so because at the level of speech, it's redundancy all over. But these are different characters that happen to have similar sounds, all right? Coincide, okay? So in speech, it's not about monosyllabic nature of Chinese. It has nothing to do with that. It simply says in speech, your pattern of entropy and redundancy is different from writing. So there's more entropy in writing, and there is more redundancy in speech. And therefore, in speech, it's just one indistinguishable sound, right? So that's nonsense. How can a piece of work is both nonsense and sense? It's mind-boggling. And I don't think Zhao gives a good explanation in the essay itself, but this fable that he constructed for the essay gives you a wonderful example of what Shannon has been doing. And Shannon was sitting in the audience as he was presenting this, all right? So this is what it looks like he translated himself into English. So you see, there's a lot of drama here. I mean, improbable story. Don't take the story seriously. He's simply illustrating writing and speech occupy different orders of redundancy and entropy. So then if we go back to this, is this one piece of writing or 2 pieces? How can it be both sense and nonsense? I just leave these questions here today, and so we can think about these theoretical issues. I know, I'm aware that I covered a lot of ground, but I hope there's a thread that can connect these various moments. And I think it's very important also for us to go to the ancient times, and for instance, Su Hui's poem, which raises similar issues, and then also compare someone like Jonathan Swift's, and then going back and forth, not looking for similarity or difference, but looking at how they deal with these problems that we can bring together to help us think about these issues. Okay? All right? Thank you.